Hey all, and welcome to the Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and discuss some of humanity's most controversial and intriguing concepts through the lens of skepticism. We have with us here today Richard Gilliver from Skeptic Takeout, Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me, and Richard Gill from the Yorkshire Atheist. Today, we will be discussing Christianity. So grab your English tea or your strawberry flavored electrolyte beverage and join us as we chit chat about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is episode 15 Christianity. Okay, hello. How are you
Hi.
guys doing today?
Very good.
Well, I'm saying where. I can't answer for both of us. I'm very good,
That's very
thank you.
presumptive.
I do that for my husband too. I'm like, oh yeah, we're good. Oh yeah, we can do dinner. Oh yeah, we can help with this.
Mine and Gilliver's relationship is slightly different to yours. I imagine.
You're not there yet.
No, not quite. I've just been busy. I've just loads and loads of uni stuff to do, and it's a bank holiday today as we're recording, and me and my wife are off work this week, so we're doing stuff this week. So I've just got lots of things to. I don't like not being busy. I can't not be busy. So,
Yep. Now that it's warm enough, we're out front doing pavers on our to extend our entryway. And yeah, I was doing that right up until recording time, like splashed water on my face and did my hair really quick. And here I am.
Well, what's nice as well with it being, because we're recording this on the 31st of May, and so tomorrow's June meteorological summer, which is exciting. So like about 30% of the light that's illuminating my face is actually natural light from, even though it's 9 p.m. It's all very exciting.
I love it. It's my favorite time of year.
Yep.
Okay, so today's topic is so long overdue. I know one of the Richards was like, I can't believe we haven't already done this topic. Yeah, Gil. But Christianity. So we've talked about religion in general. We've talked about Islam. I think we've talked about philosophy. So yeah, at episode 15, this episode's a bit overdue.
Yeah, I get the feeling it's going to be rather general as well, because there's so much to unpack in there that I think this is going to be one of those ones. Like when we got to the end of the Islam one, and we were like, we've got so much more to say. I think this is certainly going to be the first of a many-parter.
Yeah, I like the idea of episodes that have like part 1, part 2, part 3. Like we can talk about it over the course of time and like kind of
Although we've certainly got over 50 things in the spreadsheet before we even get onto the part 2 and part 3 and part 4 of things. So
well, there are 52 weeks in the year, so we can have more than 1 year worth of shows.
Yeah, there we go. Well, obviously, for people who have not,
if we haven't killed each other by then.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, obviously, for people who have not necessarily seen or heard our backstories, obviously, Laura, you and I are both former Christians.
Yes.
Gilliver, you've never entered that spiritual realm aside from sort of adjacently, just being in like the English school system. So none of us now currently are Christians, but I'm assuming, Laura, you've got family and stuff who still are potentially, or?
Yeah, not a significant amount of my family. Most of my family actually is either agnostic or atheist in terms of close family, but my extended family on my dad's side is Christian. And I do have siblings who have different various religions, but most of my siblings are like me. They're either agnostic or just full on atheist. I think it's my dad's side of the family where most of the Christian influence comes from.
Yeah, I know my family, my mum's side are sort of traditionally Catholic, but that's just because they're.
Oh, we lost him. He froze again.
And he's back. Hello.
Back.
Okay, so start off with your mom's side of the family is Catholic.
Yeah, mom's side of my family is Catholic, but that's just byproduct of being Irish, I think. So, but it's sort of not Catholic in a religious sense, more Catholic in a sort of traditional, this is just what our family is sense. So they would always go to mass on Christmas Eve and all that lot, even though it doesn't really, play a big part in their lives. But yeah, my dad's side of the family never really religious. But for me, the thing that started my birth, my
Oh,
parents
no.
didn't go to church when I was.
We're losing you a lot today.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
Where was I?
We
So
didn't
your
miss
dad's side of the
much.
family, your mom's side of the family. Yeah, it only bleeped out for a second, but
Oh,
this
okay.
should be an exciting episode if there's lots of stops and starts.
It's exciting. Yeah, like my Christian journey was really started when some people from the Boys Brigade, which is like a boys only Christian version of the Scouts, came to my junior school and sort of tried to recruit some new members. And from then, my parents were both kind of like, you remember that latent background Christianity that we have that was indoctrinated into us as children? Should we start that again? And they were like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And so it was sort of from the age of 7 or 8-ish that I sort of started then down the road of Christianity. And one of the things I've been thinking about in advance of today's episode was how lots of the ideas in Christianity seem like they make a lot of sense from the inside, but actually it's only when you sort of on the outside that things seem preposterous or outlandish or strange. Things like Jesus dying on the cross for our sins. You hear that said so many times, and obviously we've not got into definitions or anything, but like you hear those sorts of phrases and ideas so often that they just become commonplace and really, really normalized. But then when you actually think about what those things are and what they represent, it's like, that's crazy. Like it doesn't sound like something that is easily acceptable. Um,
From an
but
outside
it's,
perspective.
yeah, from the outside perspective. And I think Christians often think in those sorts of ways about people of other religions, thinking about blue gods and elephant head gods and whatever else. But yeah, the same things apply to their own beliefs, but you just don't see that from the inside. And I guess that's universal with religious beliefs.
It is. But I specifically had that same conversation with a Christian not too long ago. It was either on the perspective or it was in the after show right afterwards. Oh, I think it was in the after show. So it's not up on YouTube. But he was so insistent about his beliefs. And one thing I kept saying was, I was like, you need to understand that from our perspective, like from my perspective as an atheist and as a skeptic, what you're saying doesn't even make any sense to me. So you're trying to tell me this narrative and you're trying to present it to me as this is reality. This is the truth, like capital T truth. And you need to understand that as I'm hearing these words, it's not that I'm trying to be rude or automatically reject you. It's that you literally, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's nonsensical. It's silly even, which I know it can be
Yeah.
really insulting. But I found that is true for a lot of religions when you're on the outside of it. You're right. When you're on the inside, it's perfectly reasonable. It totally makes sense. It jives completely with reality,
Yeah.
but only because you've accepted certain things to be true that other people haven't accepted as true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Jill, if you haven't spoken, so it's naturally your turn to speak now.
It's not naturally
And
my turn to
go.
speak. I think the regarding what you were saying about it looking silly, I was party to a conversation. I wasn't involved in it, but I was party to a conversation not so long ago where someone was talking about eavesdropping. Indeed, when someone was talking, I ain't dropping no eaves, Mr. Frodo. I've just got distracted then by the 1977 cartoon version of The Lord of the Rings.
I love that one. Terrible illustration.
Backtrack. Where were I? Right. So someone was talking about the crucifix in Christianity and how bizarre it is having a symbol. It's just like having a medieval torture device as the symbol of your faith.
Yeah.
And it's when you look at it from the outside, it's like someone carrying a guillotine around with them and saying, "This is my religious symbol."
His torture and his wrongful imprisonment and his death, like celebrating that because there's this supernatural thing attached to it where by those methods we're saved. But
yeah,
I'm not sure that makes those methods. I don't know. You're right. From an outside perspective, it makes no sense.
The death isn't the point either, is it? It's the rising from the death that's the point.
Yeah.
And so are we just doing like a sort of brainstorming of rebranding for Christianity now? Are we sorting their branding out?
Well, but so I don't know how it is in England, but in America, like especially in our pop culture, like Christian music, they talk about like the suffering on the cross as being incredibly significant, like almost more significant than the resurrection, because it's like he suffered for us and we need to be grateful for it. And he suffered and God made himself to suffer as we suffer so that he understands us. And they just really focus very hard on the suffering aspect.
I think
And
that's
it's interesting
possibly
too.
that's very emotive, isn't it?
Yeah.
As a tool of persuasion.
Mhm.
In the same way as just saying someone rose for the dead for you, I guess, isn't. Like, you can't relate to that on a personal level, whereas you can relate to suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even like, I guess if you think about it, like even when you're trying to get someone to follow, say, a parent figure or a leader, you do the same thing. Like, look at how much they sacrifice for you and look at how hard they work for you, you know? So I
Mm.
guess in that respect, it does kind of make sense.
It
So
makes you feel like you owe a debt.
Yeah. Like you should be grateful. Yeah.
Yeah.
so suffering is obviously universally, I would say, to kind of the three main schools of Christianity, that is Orthodoxy and Catholicism and Protestantism, which most of the other schools like fall into subcategories of. But what else is it that's defines Christianity, do you think? Because there are self-identified Christians who don't necessarily follow all those things. And how and when do you think, would you say that Christianity became Christianity? At what point in history do you think, was it kind of when Jesus died? Was it his resurrection and the stories that were circulating at that time? Or was it later during
The
the
Nicene.
the three two
Yeah.
five was the nice Council of Nicaea, and
Yeah. The Nicene.
Constantinople was 381. And that was at the second council, the Council of Constantinople. That was where the idea of the Trinity was kind of cemented.
Well, and then there
And
was also the even later the King James version of the Bible where they redid which books go in the Bible and the
I was
translations.
getting to that.
I jumped ahead of you.
You ever had a full timeline set out, Lauren? You
I'm
just
so
jump into the.
Well,
not your turn to talk.
we had Nicaea and we had Constantinople, and
Yes.
Constantinople was 381, and it was about 400, I think it was, when I don't remember who it was. The first official kind of amalgamation of the Bible appeared, and I think it was St. Jerome. I think it was. He wasn't the first person to put all the books together, but it was the first person to put them all together in a unified language, and it all happened in kind of a 20-year timeline of the Nicene Creed being solidified at Constantinople, and then the Bible came about. And to me, that's really when Christianity, as we know it today, takes shape, in that, like in around 400, when the first Bible came together. Because up until then, they were discussion, and it's some atheists. You listen to some atheists, and you think it's this massive disparaging thing between when Jesus died and was resurrected, and then everybody else kind of coming together. And you listen to some people and you kind of get the idea that it was a real mishmash and a real mess. I don't think it was quite like that. I think there were minor points of disagreement which were solidified in around 400 at the
But
Constantinople,
some of
and then
I don't mean to cut you off, but some of the points
no,
were really
go.
significant because one of the points was whether or not Jesus was God or just a man, right?
Mm.
So when you
Yeah.
talk about minor points of disagreement, yeah, from an outside perspective, it's like, okay, if you have this like sort of story or narrative, that might be just one minor point of the story or the narrative. But then when you talk
And I
about it in
think we're
terms of a
looking at it from the
religion,
point. We're looking at it now from a point where those things have, on the whole, been decided as well. So, like,
yeah,
you assume that the people who didn't think that Jesus was God would just like some small offshoot branch who didn't really matter, because obviously the prevailing thought is what people, nowadays think. I think as well there was a big thing because obviously Jesus and his followers were Jewish, and so like there was a point, wasn't there, where they had to decide whether or not to continue being Jewish or whether to like accept Gentiles, non-Jews into their groups and stuff. And I guess that was sort of a good sort of bouncing off point much earlier than those councils and whatever else.
Didn't that start
that's
with Paul? Like, didn't Paul kind of start that
Yeah.
movement? Because Jesus never was like, teach the Gentiles. He was the
This
opposite.
is a clarification I want to make with what I was saying. You've got the time when the Bible was still being written, which don't forget, this went up until about, you're talking like some of the versions we have aren't until 200 AD. So that's a good 170 years after the alleged like death of Jesus, where this stuff was written. And that's when all the major differences were being like ironed out about, is Jesus God, is this, that, and the other. And it was at the point of the councils, which is the point I'm talking about, between the Bible, actually, the books of the Bible we have now being finished, and those councils, there was very little like major points of disagreement. It was more a coming together of ideas and trying to iron out the little bits of differences. And a lot of the books that were left out of the Bible are much later. That's why they were left out and not considered authentic.
I love a good left out of the Bible book. Love it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing I've always wanted to do, is go back and research some of those scriptures that weren't included, and read some of like the Gospel of Judas and stuff like that. And there's I guess
there's that prevailing thought, isn't there, of like they're non-biblical, like they're not part of the Bible because God has guided the people who chose the books that are in the Bible to make the decision of these are the true ones, these are the ones to read and follow and stuff.
Yeah, so then the problem with that is there's different quote unquote official Bibles that have different books that have been accepted. So like the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Christian Bible are completely different. And then I've heard, like, I don't want to say this as a fact because this is off the top of my head. I remember something about like the Ethiopian Bible includes different books than our Bible.
I've heard that as well.
And I haven't checked on that myself, but it'd be interesting to see how many different regional areas or areas of the world that have these different Bibles that include or don't include completely different books. And yet the claim across all of them is that they were guided by God, that these are the proper books to include. So my question is, like, which one y'all is right?
Yeah. I mean, and it's not just a case of a different kind of subsects of Christianity, it's the scholars themselves. If you have a look at like people like, I'm going to crucify his name, Giza Vermes, who was one of the leading authorities on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He wrote a book called The Authentic. In fact, I'll turn wrong because it's on there somewhere. The Authentic.
They were discovered in like the 70s, weren't they?
I'm not sure. No, they were much earlier than that.
We just found them around then, or was it earlier?
No, I think they were. I think I could get this completely wrong. I think they were found around the 1920s.
All right.
And it took a long time to translate them and stuff. It took years and years to translate them.
And they moved, from what I understand, they moved from hand to hand. And there was like merchants would be selling them as single individual leaflets or pamphlets or something. I don't know. I've heard a lot of stuff about it.
Because that's there's been a massive kind of thing in biblical scholarship where there was so many fakes on the market for kind of authentic early texts and stuff. There were so many fakes for authentic early texts.
Yeah, and wasn't it? Okay, so here's another thing I heard. This whole episode is going to be like, so I heard, like maybe this happened. So I'm going to feel really, really like.
No, there was a big academic thing about it. I forget the details. I'll find the details and I'll post it in our group. But there was a big academic thing where a lot of the earliest, there was trade between, I think it was a museum somewhere, and an American Christian organization that was buying up a lot of these. I don't think they were being necessarily fraudulent, but they believed these things to be genuine things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they were doing genuine scholarship on these forged documents. And it turns out that a lot of them were actually forged. And that's where, and there was a massive, it wasn't too long ago, there was a massive kind of, go.
Okay, and no, I was just gonna say, like, I heard, just to like interject and kind of add a little bit more detail, if I'm correct, is that I also heard that these people who are the forgers, that they would take documents that really did date back to that time, right? But the ink had worn off or whatever, and then they would put the ink over it. And so it was really hard to tell what was authentic and what wasn't.
Because they were using authentic paper and making the forgeries. This is a really skilled trade. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the wrong line of business, man.
I think it had something to do with France, but I could be wrong. Well, we'll look it up anyway. There's no point speculating about it if we don't know the facts. I'll get the facts and I'll post them in the group.
That would almost be a good whole nother episode, like the whole fraudulent
forgeries.
Yeah, that'd be so cool.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about like forgeries and looking at the Bible and how do we read the Bible, it's so difficult to, I mean, when you get into these conversations as we do, especially me and Laura, when we're hosting calling shows and things, and people are phoning in saying, you know, my interpretation is this, it's right, it's that. There are so many ways to read and interpret the Bible. You've got, you know, you can look at it from the believer's perspective. You can look at it from a textual criticism perspective. You can look at it from a historical perspective.
I think in a lot of ways, all those things, like those perspectives, don't even matter if you don't have the sort of basis of, do we have any good reasons to believe the Bible is worth believing?
No,
you know, like
of course.
I mean, in terms of analysis, I was just gonna say, in terms of analysis, any old scripture or any old piece of writing is worthy of textual criticism and research and examination. But where I agree with you, Gil, is when you talk about using it to build a worldview and using it for your entire belief system. That's when it's like, do we even have a good reason?
And that's often how we interact with it as skeptics. When we're talking to these people, we're asking, what good reason have you got for believing in this stuff? And but you can't just dismiss, and I think a lot of people in our community do just dismiss people on the basis that they're interpreting it in a certain way which you don't agree with, and I think that might be a mistake sometimes. I mean, if I've pulled a couple of books out just to demonstrate,
of course,
how hard it is to interpret Christianity. We've got Christian Theology, an introduction, and it's a massive book.
Yeah,
it's absolutely massive, which goes into things, and then a history of Christianity.
Oh, look at how thick that sucker is.
You know, so there's and that's, you know, two different scholars. I mean, the theology one's more of a, that is for people who are training to become priests and vicars and stuff. But the history of Christianity is one scholar and his interpretation of it. You know, obviously drawing from different sources and things, but there are lots of different people. So it's so easy to kind of get lost in the mire of what you're actually talking about. It's so important to define it.
Like your average go to church on a Sunday Christian, all of that doesn't matter, because like for a lot of people, then it's like a completely different thing of like, it's just a personal relationship. You know, like there's the whole theology and the history and the doctrines and all of that lot, but then there is just the side of people feel they've got a personal relationship with this God who they care about and who cares about them. And like it's not about the knowledge of things and all of that. It's about that emotional connection and that emotional attachment and all those sorts of things with community and all of that. And it's just part and parcel of their lives in that way. And I think Christianity as a subject is so broad because you can delve into it in your way with those books, but then in a completely other way in terms of people just living their lives in this very specific spiritually focused way.
Yeah,
well, and then I wanted, we always talk at the same time. No, I was gonna say when you do talk about like that everyday Christian who it's a more of an emotional thing, right? And then we also talk about
I didn't mean that disparagingly.
No, not at all. But I was gonna say like there's so many resources and references and scholars and people's opinions out there. So you have like the scholars who are for the Christian beliefs and the scholars who are against the Christian beliefs. And then there's like the scholars who are neutral and just present data. But then you also have a lot of just regular everyday people who are writing about their experiences. So you have people like Rick Warren or whatever that are writing like the Christian experiences, like the whole like purpose-driven life thing. And that is what like the average Christian reads. Like they don't go and read the scholarly, that history of Christianity that you just showed us. They read stuff like the purpose-driven life and no scholarship there, right? It's very inspired, very flowery words meant to elicit emotion. And we have it on the atheist side too, where it's like, here's why religion sucks, right? And it's like, here's my experiences and here's where it's bad, and it's not scholarly at all.
I just want to pick you up on one point, and it is pedantic, but you know what I'm like, I am pedantic. There's people like I'm just going to pull this out, the history of Christian History of Christianity, a little book about discipleship. That's by someone called Professor Luke Timothy Johnson. And he's a Christian, but he's very fair in his assessment. And I think sometimes we don't want to get, what I'm trying to say is we don't want to get bogged down too much in the mire of they're Christian, so therefore their opinion is all Christian and not all scholarly, because it's not the case. Some of the best Christian scholars are Christian, practicing Christians.
Well, and that's a good
academic and popular writing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good distinction to make. When I say like pro, anti, whatever, what I'm thinking about more is like what's in the page, what's in the book, right? Less so than like who the author is. So you're right. There are some really great Christian critics, or critics of Christianity who are Christians, and they're like, hey, this is where popular teaching gets it wrong, or here's where history gets it right, or whatever. So that's a good distinction to make. I also think this might be a good place to stop and jump to commercial. Okay, so do we want to do the commercial? How do we want to transition to the commercial? Okay, what do you guys want to talk about next?
I was going to ask you both if you thought Jesus was real.
Right, go on then. We'll do that.
Okay, so just be like, okay, so when we get back, I'll ask you, and then just go ahead and do that.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so when we get back, I'll be asking you both if you think Jesus was a real person.
Fantastic. All right, we will see you guys on the flip side.
Okay, so what are we up to this week? Well, I've got nothing on.
You got something on. At least a t-shirt.
Well, yeah. I'm doing a bit of Monty Python down below, though.
Aren't we all?
So I've got nothing on. Laura is busy as usual. So as the time of the recording today, but in the past for the listeners, she's just been on Secular Soapbox. So go and check her out on there. And on Tuesday, the 8th, Laura is once again returning to The Perspective. That's that brilliant call-in show on Ethan Michael's network that Laura's becoming a bit of a regular host on. So go and check her out.
Is this where I talk about the Facebook group? Right. Let's talk about the Facebook group. Yeah, we've got a Facebook group and it is wonderful and exciting, and you definitely need to be there if you're not already there. One of the things that's great about it is the fact, and we've mentioned this before, about the fact that you can just talk to us and sort of elicit our experiences and our opinions and our thoughts about things, and it's a real good way to interact with the subject matter at hand. A link to that and all of the other platforms where you can consume this wonderfully entertaining and informative show. And you can find the link to that at Linktr.ee/Skeptic Hangout, link to all of our platforms and our Facebook discussion group as well.
And that group is really good. I know we say this every week, but genuinely, it's kind of builds a community. Laura was on, as we just said, The Perspective not long ago, and I'd put Ethan in touch with a guy who was a member of the Raelian religion. Yes. And he called into the show, and then he came back onto our group, which is technically unrelated to all Ethan's stuff. And he started having a conversation with me on there, and that's carrying on. We're still messaging each other about that. So it really is a good community hub where you can find out about different things, go on to do different things. Brilliant resource.
It generates a lot of conversation, and it's not one-sided conversation. It's very much like what you said, it's a very dynamic discussion. So what I like about our Facebook group right now is that it's not an echo chamber. It's very inclusive, and I'm really hoping to grow that, and I'm hoping that it stays that way.
We've got some great fans who interact on there.
So shout out to all our followers and fans. Man, you guys are awesome.
Yeah,
agreed.
All right, gentlemen. So that wraps up all the commercials. I think that's everything we've got going on. If you guys have an idea for us for a future show or something you want to talk about, or if you want to just generate discussion in our Facebook page, go ahead and post a question and let's get talking. But for now, back to the show.
Okay, so welcome back. Before our little commercial break, during which time everyone subscribed to our channel, joined the Facebook group, all of that
Yes,
lot.
they did.
Before all of that excitingness, I asked, no, I didn't ask you both, but I said I was going to ask you both about whether or not you think Jesus historically existed. So I'm going to do that now. Laura and Gilliver, do you think that Jesus was a real person, like in actuality?
So I'm going to take this one and answer it first because Gilliver probably has a much better answer than me, and I will not be able to follow him. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, like, I have no flipping idea whether or not Jesus was a historical person or not. I find the argument for him being historical somewhat compelling in the sense of he may have been a prophet like Joseph Smith, who he was a dude who really existed and he led a movement. Whether or not he was even murdered or put to death, like, I don't know. I definitely don't buy a lot of his story. Where I would tend to say I don't think he's a historical person is that every single detail of his life, there's nothing in it. Like, it's like, okay, the miraculous birth, right? And then there's like the miraculous death, and there's all these miracles he did in between. If that much of his life, if that much of how he's portrayed in the Bible is, in my opinion, obvious bullshit, then where are the details that show that he was an actual historical person?
Yeah.
Certainly if there was a historical person it was based off of, it's been so heavily elaborated on that it's like impossible to tell which details about him would have been true in the first place. Um, and I also find Richard Carrier's stuff a little bit compelling, not so much in the cosmology of it, like the Jesus as an angel, but more in the, well, Paul is the first person who really starts the Christian movement, and Paul saw him as not a real figure, and everything else was written after Paul. So I find that part of the argument really compelling. So I jury's out, but if I was really, really pressed, I would say um, there's no historical figure that he's largely based on. If there was a historical figure, the ties to that figure will have been so tenuous.
Yeah. Right, Gilliver, impress us with your better answer.
Now blow me away.
No, it's not going to be a better answer. I think
so perfect.
I do want to, I do want to just point out something to people who aren't familiar. Dr. Richard Carrier is what's called in kind of Jesus research circles as a mythicist.
Yes.
He doesn't believe Jesus actually existed at all. I'm torn. I think I kind of err, and I have no reason to doing this, on the idea that Jesus probably existed in some form as a rabbi or an amalgamation of rabbis that got conglomerated into a story.
Yeah,
but when it comes to looking at the evidence, it's so hard to piece together the history of that period. I think the most compelling thing for me, which doesn't necessarily say that Jesus didn't exist, but certainly to me stands out a million miles, saying that there was the miracles and things associated with him were just nonsense, is that we literally have no, and I mean no, not a single contemporary source from the time saying anything about Jesus. All the reports when you look at Christian apologetics, you get you do get historians mentioning Jesus. You get like Josephus and people like that mentioning, but you don't.
But they're after the fact. Yeah.
They're after the fact.
And they mention Christians, not Jesus.
Yeah. Also, that's a very important point. Yeah. What they do is Laura's finishing my points again for me. It's good. It shows that we're on the same wavelength. No,
and that I'm really excited about it. I can't keep my mouth shut.
What they did is the people like Josephus and that they mentioned what the Christians believed. When you look at the writings, they actually say there are a group of people called Christians who believe that there was a man who they follow who was crucified. It doesn't actually, it's not contemporary to the time when Jesus was crucified. And that to me is the main thing. You've got in the Bible account, you've got all these Jewish guys who hated him. You've got the governor of the province who had him crucified, Pilate, who hated him, and or in some cases didn't hate him, depending on whether you're reading Matthew or not, and is trying to fit him into the what's the word I'm looking for? The accounts, prophetic accounts about a coming Messiah. So, in some Gospels, the Pilate is indifferent. In other Gospels, Pilate is kind of favoring towards Jesus because he doesn't like the Jews. It's an anti-Jewish kind of rhetoric. So you've got all these people, and yet you've got no accounts from the time. To my mind, if you've got these Jewish people who were really bent up and annoyed by this rabbi who was coming out and saying all these things contrary to them, to the point where they're actively trying to get him crucified, you'd think that there was some literature from the time recording that. And there is nothing. There is literally not a single extra biblical contemporary account mentioning Jesus. And that to me is a massive thing. Not to say necessarily that it didn't exist, but certainly to say that it wasn't anywhere near as important as is made out to be. If this was the single or the second most important, I think, account in the whole Christian story, if the Christian story is true, it's one of the, if not the most important events in human history. Yeah. And we've got no recording of it whatsoever.
I'd have left
no recording until after the fact.
My stance on the whole Jesus thing, I think, is very similar to both of yours. In obviously, I don't know. To me, Jesus as a historical figure and Jesus as God are two very separate propositions, and I guess the Jesus as a historical figure doesn't necessarily have much bearing on the rest of my life or anyone's beliefs or whatever, because like him existing as a human doesn't actually matter, I guess, for Christians, because him being God matters much more. I don't know if I'm explaining myself correctly, but like I have no problem with the idea that there was a man called Jesus who went around and preached and did good things and got crucified. But it's that whole question of like whether or not that guy was also God that is then the big one. And you can both imagine my opinions on that question specifically. Yeah, I know there's lots of arguments about evidence, like you were talking about, Gilliver, in terms of, we don't have evidence of this, but we do have mentionings of this, and people bring up arguments like, well, if it wasn't true, why would people die for their beliefs? Early Christians died and were persecuted and all this lot, and how true or not that is, I don't know. But yeah, like following on from what you were saying, I think if I was God and I did all these things, like I know I'm encouraging my followers to have faith in stuff, but I would have left a couple of breadcrumbs at least, like just something to give it credence for poor people like us living 2,000 odd years later, skeptically analysing this story, looking at the accounts of it from the Bible, just something to give it some sort of credence we're behind it. But like you said, the fact that there is just nothing is like a slap in the face of those things. But again, we're looking at all of these things and looking at this story without that presupposition of the biblical accounts are true.
I want to just jump in on the martyrdom point you made. The people say that if it wasn't true, why did people die for it?
Yeah.
9/11, man.
Mm-hmm. I know. I was gonna say, go for it. Say what I was gonna say.
people hijacked planes. They committed suicide. They flew themselves into buildings. They were willing to murder thousands of people
and die themselves
in the name and die themselves in the name of God. That doesn't mean that Islam is true.
And that is true. What they believe, seriously.
Yeah. The martyrdom argument is a good argument for that people will go to extreme lengths to defend what they believe is true.
And that is religious and non-religious.
Bearing on whether it's actually true or not. Not a single thing about whether it's actually true. Every single religion, you've got the kind of the famous Buddhist image from 1960, whenever it was, when the monk was sat in the middle of the road on fire.
Yeah.
People will die. they'll kill themselves for what they believe in. It does not make that thing true.
Right. You are so right that it speaks more to the human condition and more to what we are capable of than it does to any sort of religion and whether or not that religion is true.
Yeah.
And then one other thing, Gilliver, that you said earlier, that like the Josephus thing, just to kind of put that in perspective, it would be the same as us today, contemporary to today, saying something about Joseph Smith and being like, well, Joseph Smith did this, and he followed that, and this is what he believed, and this is what happened. A historian discussing any particular religious movement or religious leader or anything like that doesn't support the truth of that claim.
No. And I just want to correct you on that point, because it'd actually be like us saying that there are Mormons who believed that Joseph Smith did this.
Yeah.
That
That is true.
would,
It's even more
that'd be-
vague. You're right.
Yeah.
And then
You're
people
right.
taking the fact that we described the things that someone else believes about something that someone else said was us trying to prove that that was therefore true. Like, that is the reason, because we described this thing that those people, yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. Oh, and I wanted to go back to something that Gil said too earlier about how whether or not Jesus was historical doesn't really change like your life very much. It doesn't really have any specific impact. Like the only impact that whole conversation even has on us is whether or not Jesus was God, or whether or not the resurrection is actually.
And obviously, like the movement that was started, from then and that turned into the religion, and the religion has a big impact on people's lives and on
But
my
whether or not
life.
he was historical doesn't.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
I was
no,
gonna say it's the
really.
same thing for like Muhammad or Siddhartha Buddha or any religious person from our past, or any even political leader. Like there's people who are like, well, you can't even prove that Alexander the Great actually existed. It's like, well, I can't, but I can study the narrative and I can see how it speaks to human nature and to our condition, and I can see whether or not it links to how, like when we talk about historical events, like how does that impact our lives today, or what can we learn from it?
There's that question of whether Alexander the Great exists or not. Does that impact your life? Like,
right.
I would live my life exactly the same, whether or not it turned out that he existed.
Exactly.
And I think when apologists are going down this route of, well, there's as much evidence for Jesus as there is for X, they often use Alexander Great.
That's why I brought it up.
They do use other people as well.
Yeah.
History isn't just formed from the and I'm not saying it's not important, because it's hugely important, the textual analysis that we have left from the writings and the letters and the books and things from the time are hugely important. But that's not the only way we look at history. We have archaeology, we look at artifacts, we look at what's called material culture, and where we can take an artifact and we can see how that changes over time. That has a huge bearing on how we study history. We can look at artwork from the time. We can look at, engravings. I was in a discussion recently with someone about early Christianity, who was trying to say that we had lots of evidence for Jesus. And I compared it to Cleopatra, who was slightly before Jesus. Mm-hmm. And we have so much contemporary evidence for Cleopatra. We have engravings made by her. We have busts and sculptures and coins with a face on. Yeah, and in addition to the later historical accounts about her, written by historians after the fact, which is what we've got about Jesus, but we've got so much stuff in addition to that with Cleopatra that we don't have from the time for Jesus. It's not just a case of, we look at this and then we look at this like vague little piece of history written 100 years after, or 30, even 30 years after, and say, well, that therefore means that they existed. It's not as simple as that. It's a much wider conversation when you're looking at historical authenticity.
And I also kind of question even like the significance of that question. So if you've already rejected that Jesus is God or the Son of God, or that there is a God, like if you've rejected all the religious stuff, to try and argue whether or not Jesus was a religious or a historical figure, it starts to really become sort of asinine when, like I said, when you talk about the Bible and the accounts that we do have for Jesus and how just inflated they are and how unrealistic they are. And I almost want to say, like, what Jesus? Like, we've already agreed that the Bible is made up, right? That it's a narrative, that it's a series of stories that are told by a series of different people throughout history and then put together in a single work. We've already rejected its truth claims.
Yeah.
So
But,
why?
like, people talk about the gospel writers painting a specific picture of Jesus, like Matthew painting a specific picture of Jesus and John painting a specific picture.
And they're different
Like that question
pictures.
of like what
100%.
Jesus, I think, is a really valid one.
Yeah.
And that can to be extended to what Christianity, because
Or what Bible? Yeah.
as we said earlier, there were three main schools of Christianity anyway, and then there were countless multitudes of interpretation thereafter. You've got obviously you've got your major events in history like the Reformation with Martin Luther, which was that was incidentally came not long after the printing press came about and the first Bibles were kind of put together. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that happened. And then Martin Luther came along and the Reformation came along, and they were arguing that the common man could read the Bible for themselves in their own language.
Mhm.
And they didn't have to rely on priests or this organization or the Pope or whatever. And I think when you look at stuff like that, you do get this. You have to ask this question of which Christianity are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I
I
think,
think
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to move on to a different point. So if you've got something to say about this point, you crack on.
No, I honestly think we've kind of rounded it out well. I think the biggest thing is like tying together the two ideas, like the which Jesus in terms of historical Jesus, whether or not he was historical or not, which facets of Jesus in the Bible, but then also the which Bible. I think that those are two really good points to make. But I think a lot of Christians, I don't mean to be disingenuous, but it seems like that's not really highlighted in churches. It's not really highlighted in the teachings that there are all these disparities. It's kind of taught as it's one big monolith. It's all very
Which I think we
conforming.
covered a bit on the Easter episode, didn't we? Where we talked about like the differences in, how one gospel writer paints the story and how another one does as well. But
Yeah.
you just kind of know it as the Easter story as the combination of all of those things.
Yeah, and love has just triggered a massive kind of thing in my mind to say, not only which Jesus, but which God.
Right.
Because when you're looking at Jesus as a God figure,
Mhm.
it's hugely different to the God figure of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Obviously, they agree on
Which is kind of the point I was wanting to move on to. So
Right.
perfect.
Perfect.
I'll let you.
So that's a
I'll
good
let you
segue
make
then.
it then.
Yeah.
But you
Well, I'm
go.
going to say
Gil.
because I think obviously for those who don't know, like the Old Testament of the Bible is broadly Jewish holy texts, which then the New Testament has been added on to by Christian writers. And people, even Christians, talk about the God of the Old Testament as if it's like a separate character to the rest. The Trinity certainly, in my mind, muddies all of the waters with this idea of Jesus not only as a special man, not just a holy man, not just the son of a God, but as being God and part of this. I mean, never have I understood the Trinity as a doctrine. I've never understood it. Even when I was a Christian, I could not get that in my head. There's so many
Especially from reading the
theology book I
Bible.
showed you.
Yeah.
Oh,
That Christian
Yeah.
theology book I showed you earlier. Oh,
Yeah.
that's fun and not at all confusing when it comes to the Christian Trinity.
But yeah, I think people there is a very, if you look at it from a literary point of view, there is a very distinct, like you were saying, Laura, difference between the sort of judgments and the morals and the values in the Old Testament and the stuff in the New. And part of the way that you can sort of overlook that is by saying, well, they were just lots of things in the Old Testament are sort of rules and stories for a particular group of people in a geographical place and in a very specific time.
That's the
And
go-to.
they're not relevant to people nowadays because we're not that group of people in that time. But you listen to stories of things like David and Goliath where God helps someone murder a man, or you listen to a story of like
and then what David does as he goes on. Like that
uh-huh,
character is reprehensible. He's just a
yes,
scumbag throughout the entire account, but God loves him and favors him, and we somehow find ways to twist that into a positive
a
story.
positive
Somehow.
child-friendly story, yeah, of like just and it's a testament to the human mind that we can take such positive morals from such horrendous stories. Like Jonah and the whale. So Jonah didn't do what God wanted to do, wanted him to do. So he trapped him inside a whale for 3 days until he was like, okay, I'm sorry, I should have done what you said. And God was like, it's okay, Jonah, because
I
I
forgive
forgive you.
you. I forgive you. Because you just spent time being digested. You know?
That's a
Yeah.
really heartwarming story about forgiveness. And I think all of these sorts of things we take, I think a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, and I know this isn't an episode about the Bible, but like a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, when you actually think about what they're telling you, are really hard to digest, really,
Mm.
really hard to take in what they are. And I think it's so easy for Christians and other people as well to just want those stories to be good and positive and nice and loving in the same way as lots of the Jesus stories are in the New Testament. And that disparity between the two doesn't seem to be a problem for most Christians.
I don't understand how that is, because if you look at some of the stories, like you get the slaughtering of a whole section of people commanded by God, where God tells them to go and kill every man, woman, and male child and take the unsoiled virgin girls as spoils of war.
Oh yeah,
And
and
how can you reconcile that?
I've heard disgusting apologetics on that. Very well-meaning, very sweet Christian person, like, oh no, you just don't understand, and then trying to explain that story to me. And the apologetics are appalling. Like, what you have to do in your mind to make that okay is you have to literally vilify other people to where the people that the Israelites killed were the absolute scum of the earth, deserve to die. If they were alive
Laura, you're
today,
reading that text out of context.
it's
It's all about the
right. It's
context.
yeah, right. I mean, but the amount of hatred that you have to have for a group of people that may or may not have even existed in order to make that story okay.
That
It
God made,
reminds me
a
of,
group of people
yeah,
that God
that
made.
God made and that God designed to be that way, but are now, yeah, I mean, it gets even worse and worse and worse. That's true.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, it speaks to even to today where people can justify the killing and the slaughtering of nations of people or entire groups of people because of the us versus them mentality. And
Oh yeah,
that is just, ugh.
I did an episode on the first episode I did on a series on my channel called The Best of Men, which is the first one was Jesus, and I did Muhammad, and I've yet to do Siddhartha, who was the Buddha. And when I was talking in that episode, I was using sources from proper Christian sources from reverends in the States, which was citing biblical passages in the support of slavery.
Yeah.
And
how slavery is actually a good thing if you're doing it the biblical way.
It's not just as a lot of people see it now, a New Testament against an Old Testament thing. These this is recent history where it's been used to support major. I mean, even now it's used to support like some abhorrent things, like you get the Phelps family and things who are like a little cultish offshoot of Christianity who like are really against homosexuals and stuff. But that was a world trade in human life, and it was being justified by people using biblical texts.
And I'm
And
wondering
I'm not
if
to be a slavery apologist, but like if your whole worldview is based around the fact that the Bible is true and good and wholesome, like you can almost understand why people are like, but this is what it says here, and so this must be fine. And I'm not
right.
trying to, I'm not defending slavery.
So
I'm not
no, but you're
defending
right. There
slavery,
is
but, like,
the if there really is a God and it came from God, then it must be good. Like there is that justification
Yeah.
where it shuts off all critical thinking whatsoever, and it's just accept it. And
I've heard that because God commanded it, it was justified,
it must be
and
good.
it's good. Yeah.
Yeah, but what I'm more interested in is like whether or not Christianity teaches sort of a selective empathy, if that makes any sense. Like you have to love your neighbor, you have to help the poor, you have to love people, but it's okay that the entire Canaanite civilization was murdered, and it's okay that we had like the millions of people enslaved through a long period of history. Like slavery, people don't understand, just recently ended. It's been predominant throughout human history, and it still goes on today. Actually, I shouldn't even say it's ended. It's been like officially ended in the United States and officially ended in England, but it still goes on even in the United States and in England. Slavery is an ongoing thing, and it is abhorrent. And so there's sort of like this selective, like, I'm going to be really empathetic as a Christian toward these people or these things or my neighbors or my children or my church group or my community, but then I'm not going to have any empathy whatso fucking ever for this other group of people because I don't want to understand them. I don't need to understand them. They're like the lack of empathy that I've seen towards people like Muslims, right? Or the whole like the Nazis and what they were able to justify doing to the Jews, right? That whole mentality to me is like, I don't understand how you can have so much love and compassion and empathy over here, and so much hatred and lack of consideration for human life and human wellness over there.
And I think
And
as well,
I want to defend Christianity, Richard. I just want to
No,
jump in
you
it quickly here just to defend Christianity here, because I've seen that in other religions too. This is not solely a Christian thing; it's a human nature thing.
it is, yeah,
I've literally heard senior Buddhist monks
yeah.
talk about, in person, talking to me, to myself, and they've outright stated that Islam should be wiped off the face of the earth because it's an evil religion.
And that means killing
It's
Muslims, yeah.
it's not just a Christian thing. That it's a human
No,
nature thing.
and
I
that
think.
is something I should get better at sort of putting out that disclaimer right off the bat because I don't believe that religions are responsible for anything. I believe that people are responsible for stuff, and they use their religions in order to make these justifications. So I don't see religion, including Christianity, as anything more than a social construct, and it's a tool, and we use that tool in different ways. What I don't understand is how well, I do understand it, but I guess I kind of rail against it. Like I kind of like my brain can't quite empathize with this mentality of, and you're right, it's a human mentality of I care about this life over here, but I could give a shit about this life over there because they're the other, they're the enemy, and I just don't get the whole concept of like the enemy.
Again, I want to disagree with you. I'm sorry. I need to disagree with you again because
Go
I
for
do
it.
get that mentality. Because I can tell you now, and I'm sure you will both, when I say this, you will both say, oh, yes, definitely. If I was walking in the street and I had my 5-year-old daughter by my side
Mhm.
and there was a chance she was going to be killed or seriously injured, and there was someone else's 5-year-old daughter in the same position, I'd rescue mine first every single time. If I could, I'd rescue both. If I couldn't, mine would be my first response on every single occasion.
I agree with
And
you there. Yeah. I think you're right. This is a very nuanced conversation. I think the nuance that I'm talking about is more like when we're talking specifically about these Bible references in the apologetics, when we're talking about slavery was okay back then, or
yeah,
wiping out all those people was okay back then. So I'm talking about a very nuanced sort of circumstance here because I agree with you. I think that human nature applies to all of us, including myself, in those circumstances.
yeah.
But these other circumstances of no, the slavery in the Old Testament was fine because it was for those people at that time. That to me shows that your empathy for human life in general is selective. Like you
Yeah,
just don't care about how it was for
and
those
and
people.
when it's and agreeing with you here for once.
I like the disagreements because it gets us to get more deep into the conversation.
When it's a group mentality, so a certain group of Christians or a certain group of Muslims or Buddhists or whatever,
Right.
when they're getting together and they get into that does perpetuate and reinforce that idea even more. So it's not just a case of I'm going to rescue this person because they're close to me. It's a case of reinforced mentality. I've interpreted that in that way, so that reinforces again, and then we talk amongst each other and that reinforces it again, so it does amplify it
Because
when you've got these religious organizations.
if you ask that same person if they would be willing to be a slave under those conditions, I think they'd be lying. I mean, I don't like to call people liars. I like to give them the benefit of the doubt, but my brain would jump to you're lying to me if you think that you find those conditions acceptable for yourself and not just some other random person.
I think it's understandable to find it more difficult to have empathy for people who died thousands of years ago than it is for people who stood there in front of you in the moment. I think that's understandable. But like all it takes is a little bit of thinking about, well, actually these were people, not like cartoon people on an explanation video about in a history lesson, like actual people with feelings and thoughts and emotions like you and me and everyone else we know. And all it takes is that little bit of thinking to be like, yeah, it would have been really shit, wouldn't it?
Right.
Like it's not a hard jump to make.
Well, and that's
Yeah,
why
and I
I
think
say, like,
that's
put yourself in those shoes. Would you be willing to be
Yeah,
that slave? Like, or
yeah,
do you want to be the master? Because it sounds to me a lot like you want to be the master. And I know
yeah,
I'm not
and
being very, very gracious with that statement, but it kind of hits a
I
nerve
think
for me.
it also that highlights the importance of a part of the way we study history as well, and looking at material culture. So it's not just about looking at the what's written in the text and what people believe is written in the text. It's looking at the objects and the way people's attitudes change towards a certain object or a certain piece of artwork associated with that religion over time. And it, because that's a representation of cultural change, and it does give you a deeper insight rather than just saying this is a holy book, so therefore it means this. If you look at the way it changes and the different interpretations, it does give you that wider understanding.
because I think that I know we don't have much time left in the episode, but I think that goes on to, and obviously I'm going to geek out about language because that's what I do as a linguistic nerd. But like, there's been lots of talk that I've seen of things like various Christian doctrines have only sort of come about from mistranslations of scripture, or the fact that Mary was a virgin, it was a virgin birth for Jesus, for example, may have been from a mistranslation of a Greek word meaning just young girl, in which case the miraculous virgin birth of Jesus wasn't miraculous. Like
Right.
things like that, that even from our parents' generations, well, Richard, you're my parents' generation, but like, each of our parents' generation, language has changed since then to now. Meanings of words have shifted ever so slightly and tweaked this way or that way. As language always does, language change is a natural, ongoing phenomenon that just continues and will continue after we're all long dead.
Yeah, and I love the. I mean, there's a reason I forgot what they call it. Richard may know the Oxford, some kind of Oxford linguistic resource dictionary, and it actually traces the meanings of the usage of words back from
Yeah.
their inception to the. I think it's an academic thing, so I'm not sure how much access you get if you don't have a connection to a facility or something which will allow you to sign in. But it's a brilliant resource.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've even I've done that through Google even, like, and I think they do use Oxford. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, I mean, it doesn't take long to kind of do the research on that and find out where words came from and how they were originally used. And
Yeah.
you're right, like it's a complicated beast. And so how
And then
much
because and we've spoken before about how there are no original transcripts of any of these documents. We've got copies of copies of copies that Christians assume have been copied uh, faithfully. We're in a position where you can go into a Christian bookshop and buy any number of translations of the Bible, which are sort of geared in different directions based on the choices the translators have made, and the translators of those Bibles are translating earlier copies that were translated from another language that were early, like, and it's all that ongoing
Yeah,
change.
a prime example of that is the Jehovah's Witness,
Ooh, yeah.
their copy, because they, in every case, they call God Jehovah, but that was a scribal error. That didn't appear in the Bible until like the 10th century. It was an amalgamation of Adonai, which means my God, and the Tetragrammaton, which is YHWH, Yahweh. And it was those words that got like compressed together in a mistranslation. And that's where the name Jehovah comes from. And in the Jehovah's Witness Bible, it's everywhere. It just replaces the word God.
So I think if there's anything we can get out of this, because it's coming right up to the end of our episode, we only have like minutes left. But I think if there's anything that we can get from all the things that we've talked about is that historically, scripturally wise, interpretation, there's so much out there that differs and contradicts, and like it's really hard to get at when you talk about like Christianity. What are your feelings on Christianity? If you approach it from a scholarly perspective versus just whatever you happen to have been exposed to, then you start to get like, well, what do you mean by Christianity? Well, who's Christianity? And so it becomes this huge beast of opinion and scholarly resources, and it just becomes almost overwhelming and difficult to
I
talk
think there's
about.
just taking those couple of steps backwards and just having a look at it from a bit of a further afield is a
Yeah.
really useful thing to do. And I think one thing that I do want to say just before we finish, is for anyone who thought, oh, they're doing an episode on Christianity, they're definitely going to talk about this and this and this, and we haven't talked about any of those things. Please do go to the Facebook discussion group and talk about them there, because we'll probably finish this episode and think, oh, I absolutely wanted to spend 20 minutes talking about.
We knew we were going to be pushing this one and that we were not going to get anywhere near enough. Right. Final, we're really running short of time. Final thoughts, 30 seconds each. Gil, go.
I think the impact that Christianity has had on Western culture is immense. And you look at sort of music and architecture and art and language, poetry, songs, it's all, a lot of it has had so much influence from Christianity. And I think that sort of influence is profound in a way that we never really will fully understand. But in a way, we've got a lot to thank Christianity for in those sorts of ways, for promotion of lots of different things. So yeah, that's a random thing I've just said. Laura.
I love it. No, I want to second everything you just said, because it really does play a huge role in our cultures. But I would say that Christianity for me overall is it's a social phenomenon that has a fascinating and intriguing historical sort of backdrop to it. And learning about the history for me is fascinating. Learning how it has impacted lots of civilizations from the time of its inception till now, and seeing the interplay between Christianity and the surrounding religions and its source religion, Judaism. There's so much more to say there. Like so much more. So we'll have to do another episode. But to me, it's all fascinating.
Yeah, and I would just say that, I think it's really important, if you, no matter whether you're a Christian or a member of a different religion, or just someone doing casual research into it, just remember that there were so many ways to interpret it. You don't just go down the idea of Christianity is this, right, because you're probably simultaneously right and wrong.
Right.
So I'll hand you over to Laura to finish.
All right. With that, I don't even have anything to say to finish it, other than we are Laura,
Richard,
and Richard, and this has been Skeptic Hangout. Until next time,
keep questioning,
interrogate your beliefs,
and stay skeptical.
Oh man, I thought we were gonna get cut off. We did it.